Today's date is June 18th, 2024. I'm interviewing Ronnie Rutlinger. My name is Fabulous Flores. We are located in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, and the language the interview is being conducted in is English. Good morning. Would you please state your name at birth and your name now?
Renate Reutlinger, and now Renate Breslow.
What is your birth date?
July 23rd, 1930.
How old are you now?
93, going on 94.
Where were you born?
Germany.
Where in Germany?
Stuttgart, Germany.
What were your maternal grandparents' names?
My grandmother's name was Johanna Strauss. I don't recall my grandfather's first name.
Okay. Can you tell us about them, or do you not have much?
Well, we visited my mother's parents a lot. They lived way up north in a very small town called Milan. They had a farm, a big farm. They had cows and horses, chickens, and lots of land. And it was primitive times where you just had the kitchen heated, so all the other rooms were chilly in the winter time. And I enjoyed watching my grandmother making butter, churning it. It was white and delicious, and she was a wonderful cook, and I really enjoyed my visits there very much.
And what about your paternal grandparents?
Mom's dad had passed away years before, and his mom died shortly. I think it was 2 or 3. I never got to know her very well.
So you don't have any memories of the paternal side?
Very little.
What was your mother's name?
Ellie Reutlinger. Strauss. Her maiden name, you mean? Ellie Strauss.
Where was your mother born?
In Germany. I think Milan. I'm not sure.
Did she have any siblings?
Yes, she had 2 sisters. Liesel Strauss, and her older sister was Idel, I-T-E-L. Mom was in the middle.
What was your father's name?
Gustav Reutlinger.
And where was your father born?
Also in Germany, I think Haigerloch.
Did he have any siblings?
2. There was a younger brother, Willie, and an older brother, Sigbert. He also was in the middle.
Were you close with your aunts and uncles on either side?
I was very close with my father's brothers because we lived in the same place in Kirchheim. And Mom's family was way up north, so I didn't get to see them as often.
What type of education did your parents have?
It's hard to say. There was something beyond high school that Dad attended, but I don't know how they classified it. I know he went to the service shortly after high school, so I'm not exactly sure.
And did your mother go all the way through school as well?
She also went through Yale.
How would you describe your family's economic status?
They were wealthy.
What did your parents do before the war?
My dad had a business. He had sort of a dry goods store. I know he employed 8 girls working in the store. he sold other stuff too. I wasn't sure, but it was really a store that he maintained.
And did your mother work in the store as well?
Sometimes, yeah.
Can you tell me about your life in Germany before the war?
Well, I'm always reminded of one incident which was pleasurable, which I was about 4 years old. We lived very close to the Black Forest, and my favorite Uncle Willie, Dad's younger brother, and I had walked through the forest. We've done it many times. This particular time, it began to rain, but a soft rain. And I remember we took shelter under this big tree, and the whole forest was full of lily of the valley, and the smell was just wonderful. And I just thought it was a perfect moment, together with my favorite uncle, in a beautiful forest with the smell of lily of the valleys. I always think of that if I'm looking for something serene and peaceful.
What was your house like? Or was it a house? Was it an apartment?
It was, our home took up an entire block. Dad had it built. And the very first floor was the business. The second floor was our residence. And then there was the third floor, which was rented out to an older German couple.
What was the town that you grew up in like? What was there a synagogue? Was there a large Jewish community?
In Kirchheim, where we lived, there was a very small Jewish community. Therefore, we didn't have a synagogue. But in Dad's home, where he grew up, in his former home, the entire living room was used as a shul on holidays, such as the Torah and all the trimmings that you bring to shul were in his home. And we all went to his house for the main holidays instead of a synagogue.
Is Kirchheim, or was Kirchheim, a small town, or is it more city?
Kirchheim?
Yes.
Was a small town. The bigger town was about an hour away, Stuttgart, where I was born. So when we went to the theater, every Sunday morning. Dad drove. It was a children's theater. And they had children's programs, and half of them scared me, the Grimm fairy tales. And there were bears and all kinds of animals, and it was a scary thing. But we went every week to Stuttgart to go to the theater, the children's theater. And my favorite part was outside was a place where you could put money in, and you can pick out a sandwich or some nice dessert. And when the theater was over and we went out, and I was allowed to pick a sandwich of my choosing, and Daddy would put money in and bring it, and it would come out. That was my favorite part.
What was your first experience with anti-Semitism?
My very first experience with anti-Semitism was after the Nuremberg laws were passed. They were passed in 1935, but it was 1936 that I was in first grade. And one of the Nuremberg laws was that, actually several of them, my very first experience would be when the Nuremberg law that was passed, that no non-Jew was allowed to work in a Jewish home. Now, we had a live-in housekeeper. Her name was Sophie. She and I shared a bedroom. We ate our meals together. She was, to me, my best friend. And when she walked out on us, that was my first heartbreak. She was not Jewish, so she wasn't allowed to work in our home. I also noticed that another law was that no non-Jew should be shopping in a Jewish store. And I remember curled up on the windowsill in front of our large display window, and I watched two members of the Nazi Party in full uniform, with rifles slung over their shoulders. They were marching back and forth in front of our home. And of course, no customers came. That was indeed the end of Dad's business. But to me, the most dramatic Nuremberg law was no Jewish child was allowed to go to public school. And again, at that point, I was in first grade. And one day, after class, the teacher calls me to her desk and tells me I can't come back to school because I'm a Jew. And I was devastated, and I couldn't understand what's different about me from the rest of my classmates. No, I was the only Jewish child in the class. For that matter, I was the only Jewish child in the whole school. So, of course, the only one affected. And I remember wandering out into the schoolyard, and the friends I'd walked to school with that morning, they'd all left without me. And the only ones there were just a handful of young German boys. They followed me home, taunting me all the way. But I also had a very best friend. We'd been playing together almost since we could walk. Marianne. She waited for me that dreadful day, walked home with me, but I never saw her again. And I finally asked Mom what happened to Marianne, and Mom explained. When her dad came home from work and discovered that she tried to be my friend, he took off his belt and beat her. He would not allow her to play with me again. But getting to the future, almost 87 years later, I heard from Marianne. She was still in Kirchheim. She had read about me in the newspaper, the daily newspaper that came. I spoke to German kids for quite a few years, and apparently recently there had been a story about me in the German paper, and she read about it. And she said to her her brother, "That's me. They're talking about me. I remember Renate." And she was Marianne. And the brother contacted the teacher who I was in touch with and told them they had found Marianne. And we were able to meet virtually. It was just a couple of weeks ago. And she's changed. I think I have too. And it was really nice speaking to her. And she said she remembered walking home with me. And she said, you cried all the way. No, I'd forgotten that, but I can certainly understand. And she apologized, telling me she wanted to play with me, but her dad wouldn't let her. And so she was one of those that just ignored me altogether. But she also explained that the next year, 4th and 5th grade, they had a Nazi male teacher who told them about Jews and that Jews were big liars and they couldn't be believed. And that's the teaching she had. And through her, I also discovered that Kirchheim turned into a real strong Nazi hold. During the war. This is after we left. So through some miracle, we will be speaking again. And I found Marianne after all these years. All these years later.
In retrospect, looking back at it, prior to the Nazis coming in and teaching the students about Jewish people. Do you think Marianne, or the other kids for that matter, even really understood that you were Jewish?
No. I think they had no idea as to why. But I did ask her, after I couldn't come back to school, did the other kids say anything? Did they say, how come Renate isn't here? And she said, no, I was never mentioned. Meantime, I was totally boycotted. Nobody played with me, and it was a very bitter time for me because I was so much alone. I didn't go to school, and I had no friends, so it was a lonely time for me.
How did you spend your days as a child if you weren't in school? How did you spend your days as a child if you weren't in school and you weren't with friends?
Very bored. I tried to play alone. I mean, I had no options. And my parents were very, very busy trying to find a way to get out of Germany.
How did the war begin for you?
Well, the war came years later. World War II?
Yes. Meaning, how did your world, when did you realize that something was going on?
Well, as soon as the teacher said to me, you can't come back to school, and I lost all of my friends, former friends, I knew there were there was definitely changes in my life. At the same time, my parents, who had gone to Palestine to visit in 1934, Dad already felt something is wrong and wanted to remain in Palestine, as Israel was called at the time. And Mom wasn't quite ready. And after Kristallnacht, Dad wanted to go back to Palestine. He had purchased a piece of land on purpose so that he would be able to go back into the country. But the English government that controlled Palestine would not allow German Jews into Palestine. And so we had to find another place to go. If the English government had allowed the German Jews to go to Palestine, most of European Jewry would have been saved. By keeping them out, it made the German Jews look for other places, and it was very difficult to find a spot. Mom and Dad were actually discussing the situation in about right after Kristallnacht, when Dad gets an unexpected phone call from a former classmate. He now owned a travel agency, and he told my father that he had room on one ship to go to Cuba. Somebody had just passed away, and he was giving Dad the chance to leave Germany. And as much as Dad wanted to leave, he wasn't that keen about leaving Mom and I behind. Mom, in her wisdom, insisted this unexpected opportunity, go, take it, leave. And Dad left. And that left Mom and I homeless. So we moved back to Stuttgart. But Mom had already purchased 2 tickets on another ship going to Cuba to join Dad. And our ship was going to go June the 1st, 1939, a couple of months after Dad. And one day, the owner of the travel agency called her and said, there's so many Jews leaving Germany and going to Cuba. we have this new ship that we set up. It's a big ocean liner. It's going to have 8 decks. It's going to hold 1,000 people. But the most important thing to Mom was the date. It was going to leave May 13th, 1939. And he asked her, would you like to change your reservations? And Mom immediately said yes. And that's how we got to take the ship to St. Louis, May 13th, 1939, which left Hamburg, Germany at that point.
If we could backtrack just a bit to when before your father's left, what do you remember about Kristallnacht? Or what memories or stories do you have from that event?
I have very few memories prior to, because except for the fact that I was very lonely. I was totally isolated. Not one child talked to me or played. They just ignored me as though I didn't exist. So even though surrounded by a lot of other kids, I was alone because I was totally ignored. So I just remember being very, very, very lonely. And my parents, of course, were very busy trying to find a haven, a place for us to go to. So they had not much time for me at that particular juncture. Kristallnacht did not affect us because in Kirchheim was a very small Jewish community. And also, before Dad left on the ship to go to Cuba, he had to sell our home. And he was, what we learned later was the head of the Gestapo wanted to buy our house. And one reason that nobody touched our house with the store and business was because the orders from the head of the Gestapo in Kirchheim were not to do that. And the reason was he knew eventually he would be getting our home. So before they allowed Dad to leave Germany, he was called into Gestapo headquarters. And they asked him to sign some documents. And he read the documents through, and he realized that he's almost giving his house away. So he protested, and they just laughed at him. And they said, don't sign those papers, but the papers you need to legally leave to go to Cuba, we're not going to sign. So, of course, Dad signed the papers, giving the house over to the head of the Gestapo, and then he left.
So when you say your father, when he left for Cuba, it would leave you and your mother homeless, that's what you're referencing, that he had to sell the home before he could leave?
Yes, he had to sell our house before he left.
Okay. Where did you and your mother end up?
Well, after Dad sold the house, of course, we were homeless. So we moved back to Stuttgart, which was a bigger city. And in Stuttgart, we lived in a boarding home. We had actually, Mom rented a room, just one room, in that boarding home. But remember, she had the tickets to leave shortly thereafter, so which was going to be June the 1st, so we could join Dad in Cuba. And what happened to the ship that was going to leave June the 1st? That ship never even left Germany. It just never went to Cuba. So we would have been stuck in Germany. But instead, we took the ship that was offered to us at an earlier date to St. Louis, May 13th, instead of June the 1st.
What did you and your mother, take with you when you were packing for?
When we were going to Cuba, we were only allowed one suitcase per person. So Mom packed my suitcase. And I clearly remember I had I had a lot of stuff. I had a lot of books and games and different toys. And it was very, very difficult for me to decide what am I going to take. Because my mom's telling me, you're allowed to take one item, just one, that you want. But that's all we have room for on in the suitcase. So I finally, after thinking it over many times, chose a collection book. And the only reason I chose the stamp book was because with all the waiting time I had, because again I had no playmates, my uncle really tried to keep me busy. So he bought a stamp book, he bought stamps, and he helped me put the stamps into the stamp book. In the meantime, he's explaining the history to me and the geography. He was, knowing that I wasn't learning in school, he was trying to be helpful and give me a small education. So I didn't know at the time I had that stamp book whether I'd ever see him again. I knew we were leaving to join my dad. So being that I didn't know whether I'd ever see him again, I thought the proper thing to take is the stamp book. It'll always remind me of my favorite uncle. And that's what I chose. I left everything else there. So I chose my stamp collection in my stamp book to take with me in the one suitcase that was given to me.
Okay. So going back to May 13th, you and your mother board the SS
We
St.
boarded
Louis.
the ship, the St. Louis, right.
What are your earliest memories of that ship? Being on
Well,
that ship?
actually, to me, it was an adventure. I enjoyed my experience on the ship because Mom was explaining to me, we're taking a ship going to Cuba to be with your dad. And I only heard being with your dad. I was always a daddy's girl, and the idea of going together to my dad made me very happy. So I knew we were traveling to be with my dad. And it didn't matter what country we were traveling to. So I was very happy at the thought. So it was a really big ship. It was a luxurious liner. It had 8 decks to explore. There was a large toy room with all kinds of toys and games to play with on that ship. In addition, there were 2 swimming pools. So there was a lot to do. So I enjoyed very much the trip, mainly because I was thinking at the end of this trip, I'll be together with my father. So that's why I was very happy on the trip.
Are you able to recall what the atmosphere was like for the other passengers along the voyage?
Well, I was just a little girl, so I didn't really pay that much attention to anybody else. By this time, I was pretty much accustomed to being alone, so I didn't really seek too many friends. I mean, I played with kids occasionally, but mostly I was by myself because I became used to being alone because I was alone in Kirchheim, so I was alone on the ship as well.
Did your mother make friends with anyone, or did she?
My mother, yes. My mother always had people she spoke to and spent time with while we were on the... Everybody was pleasant to everybody else. The whole point was everybody was happy to get out of Germany. And they were, later I learned, they were all seeking freedom. And going to Cuba, we would have our freedom, we thought, at the time.
Can you recall about how long the voyage was?
I have the dates, but it's over a month, I think.
So you get to Cuba. And then what happens once the ship arrives at Cuba?
Oh, we arrived in Cuba. Yeah, we arrived in Cuba very early in the morning, somewhere around 5 a.m., very early. I was very, very excited. We had an early breakfast in the ship's dining room, and I'm thinking, soon I'll see my dad, I'll be with my dad. When the loudspeaker beckoned us on deck, and we looked overboard, and there was my father. He was standing up in this tiny little rowboat. He was waving at us, and I'm sure I waved back. Years later, he explained that he knew the ship to St. Louis was on the way, and so he stood on the shore in Havana throughout the entire night. He just wanted the ship, the moment the ship arrived, the moment, which was that early, he paid a Cuban to row him as close to us as he was legally allowed. So he was certainly the first visitor to any of us. He was just as happy to see us as we were to see him. But that, of course, was my last happy moment on the ship. I mean, I do recall seeing in front of the cabin doors all the suitcases. People had suitcases with name tags, which would be taken off the ship as we got off in Cuba. And then every day I said to my mother, when are we getting off the ship? And she always responded with, tomorrow. Now I have to give you some background, if you want.
Yes, please.
What happened was that even though we had paid for our voyage, and actually we also had a separate document. It was called a legal landing certificate, which we had to purchase. And that legal landing certificate was signed by Cuba's Minister of Immigration. Now, that was our guarantee that we would be able to get off the ship in Cuba, that legal document. But regardless, what happened, the Cuban government would not allow us to get off the ship. And what is often forgotten, there were 2 or 3 ships trailing our ship. A matter of fact, we were in a race with one ship. On the other ships, all going to Cuba, were more German Jews. So we're not talking about thousands of German Jews. And when the captain of the other ships saw that we were stuck in Cuba and not allowed to get off the ship, they turned their ships around and they headed back to Germany. And it took me years to learn what happened to these people that went back to Germany. And I did learn that when they arrived in Germany, the German government wouldn't let them get off the ships either, saying, you lost your citizenship when you left Germany. And I learned that they were taken to concentration camps. And that's as far as I was able to trace the other ships. Meantime, our captain, the German captain Gustav Schröder, was asked by the German government to bring the ship back to Germany. And according to Mom, he met with the adults and he told them he would never, under any circumstances, bring the ship back to Germany, no matter what. Now, he was a young man, and he had a young wife and 2 little girls in Germany. But he said he would never go back, and that is really what saved our lives. Instead, he sent cablegrams to the American government. Now, that was under the leadership of the Democratic Franklin Roosevelt, who never responded to his request to allow us entry into America. And what also isn't known, most of the passengers, which included Mom and I, had already legal affidavits to come to America 2 months later. In other words, we were staying in Cuba just for that 2 months period. Then all three of us, Dad, who was in Cuba, Mom and I, would come to America legally. And in case you didn't know, Ellis Island, it was still open in 1939. But Roosevelt never responded to the pleas. And he was trying now, our captain, Gustav Schroeder, to find other places for us to go because he was not going to take the ship back to Germany. It became a worldwide story. It was in the papers in Philadelphia, and my son, many years later, went to Temple and gave me a microfilm of, there was an Inquirer, a Bulletin, a Record, a Daily News, and the story of the St. Louis was front page on all Philly papers, so it was no secret. Everybody knew we were stuck and had nowhere to go, but nobody offered to assist us. So one day, while I'm playing on deck, I felt the lurching of the ship, and I realized, by this time I was 8 years old, by the way, we were moving. So I really panicked, and I rush into Mom's cabin, only to see her lying on her cot, sobbing uncontrollably. So I wander up on deck, and that's when I see men and women, and the tears are streaming down their faces. Again, I'm 8 years old. I have no clue what's going on. I do know this. I know we're leaving Cuba. I know we're leaving my dad because he wasn't with us. I had no clue where we were going. And I probably would have been even more scared if I'd realized the adults had no clue where we were going. And our poor captain, our German captain, Gustav Schroeder, was desperately trying to find a place to put us as he was being pushed out of Cuba. We passed the Miami coastline so close that every passenger aboard the St. Louis could easily see the shimmering lights of Miami Beach. That's how close we came to Miami. And coming towards us from Miami was a U.S. Coast Guard cutter with guns. I remember waving to the captain. 8 years old, I was sure the captain was there to help us. I didn't know that he had orders in his pocket from the President Roosevelt telling him, get the ship out of U.S. waters pronto, which is what he did, forcing the ship to leave Miami, which we were forced to do. We then began to circle the Atlantic Ocean. And finally, a Mr. Trooper, who was the head of an organization called the Joint Distribution Committee, and he was situated in France, he was able to find 4 countries to take us in. And those countries were England, Holland, Belgium, and France. And the whole sad story of the St. Louis was that Holland, Belgium, and France were overrun later on by Germans, and not all, but too many of the passengers recaptured. Of course, all those that went to England were saved. The whole ship went to Antwerp, Belgium, and that's where I remember seeing people leaving the ship. And now, of course, I know that they left to go to England, somewhere around 250. And I'm happy to say every one of them was saved. Mom and I, we went to Holland. 181 went to Holland. And I remember us boarding a much smaller ship. And as we were going around the Dutch coastline, a lot of Dutch people seemed to be on that coastline, all waving to us and wishing us well, which made me feel just a little bit better. So we ended out in Rotterdam, and in Rotterdam we were all placed in a detention camp called Rotterdam West. And that's when Mom and I were separated. She was put in what they called an adult compound, and they put me in a children's compound. So I didn't see very much of her in the detention camp.
Do you know how the captain was able to find these countries to take in the ship?
Did I know?
Do you know how the captain was able to get these countries to take in the passengers from the ship?
Well, he was just following the orders. It was Mr. Trooper, the head of joint distribution. He handled that.
Okay.
He was able to get the 4 countries to take us in. I'm sure there was money distribution and so forth. It didn't come from nothing. But the captain was just happy to get rid of the passengers. And he brought the ship back to Germany. And many times I'm asked what happened to him. Because Captain Schroeder, of course, did not follow the orders of the German government when he didn't bring the ship back. And what happened to him, he knew, because he'd been already told. He was fired from his job. But he got another job, and nothing happened to him. They just left him alone.
Can you describe more about Rotterdam West? So was it clean, dirty? How were you treated? Were you free to come and go? Things like that.
Rotterdam West was a detention camp that was horrific. It was horrible. It was right by the Atlantic Ocean. So though it was fenced in, I mean, the people in the camp could not leave. There was a guard at the gate. And you could only leave if you had permission. And then you could walk out the gate, but you couldn't just walk out into Rotterdam. You were stuck there. It was a dump. It had no grass. It was just dirt. And being Holland had a lot of rain, so it was just dirt. And it was an empty camp. Most importantly to me was there wasn't enough food. And I remember I'm only 8 years old, so I didn't eat that much. But there, you sat down at this central a big table, and you were given a plate of food, and a small plate of food, and that was it. So you could eat it, you could toss it. It's not like on the table is some rolls or some bread or something else. That was it. You got your plate, like in a hospital where you're given one plate, and whether you liked it or not, that was it. And you were fed twice a day, morning and night. And the winds were hurling in. I got a severe eye infection, the rim of the eye, from the winds that were hurling into the camp. I saw very little of my mother. I spent most of my time, once again, alone, because she was in the adult compound. And but one nice thing that happened once, a big truck came into the children's camp, and the back of the truck opened up, and a whole bunch of clothing came came out, was spilled out. And I remember just standing there, and then I thought, I better help myself. There's no one here for me. And I just grabbed this blue coat, which sort of saved my life because it kept me warm, because we got there in June. This is October, and we're still in that detention camp. In the meantime, Dad came to the U.S. 2 months later, legally. You remember I mentioned that 2 months later all of us could have come to America. Well, from Cuba, he came to America that 2 months later with no problem, none at all, just... and of course his first job was to get us out. And he said, Mom, all the proper papers. And she had the opportunity to leave the camp and go to the... in Rotterdam, the person in charge that would help us come to America. But the problem was he didn't help us, and it made everything very, very difficult. So the time in Rotterdam was, I would say, was a horrible experience, with just not enough food and not enough of anything, for that matter. It was just a bare place to spend, to waste your time.
How did you and your mother eventually get to leave?
Get to what?
Get to leave.
Leave?
Yes.
That was because when Dad came to America, the very first thing he did was go to Washington for the papers. Remember, we would have been able to come to the paper. Legally, we were allowed to come to America. But what always makes me sad is that we were 181 total. All of them could have come because Holland stipulated they would only take those that would soon be able to go to America legally. And that's how we got into that group. But they were in family units, and nobody was able to help them. So Dad had to purchase more documents for us to come, and Mom had to get permission he was called the commander. That was the guy in charge of the entire camp, and she needed permission from him to leave the camp to go to the person in Rotterdam, what are they called? That hand out applications for you to leave the country. So I can't think of the name right now. Do you know what they're?
I'm not sure of the name now.
Oh, so but at any rate, he.
The embassy?
Huh?
The embassy?
The embassy. That's it. Simple. They just didn't. Thank you. Yeah, right. The American embassy that was located in Rotterdam, and all he had to do was give us transportation, and instead he said to Mom that there were no more ships leaving Holland. This is a person in charge. And his recommendation to my mother was, you stay in the camp, Rotterdam West, until the war is over, and then you travel to America with your daughter. Now, the war had not started in Holland at the time we were there. Apparently the adults knew there would be a war, and there was in Holland later. But at the time we were there was no war. I mean, it was a ridiculous statement of his. And even I, as a kid, could figure out it didn't make any sense. We're to wait in a camp until the war starts, and then we're going to stay happily in that camp until the war's over, and then we go to the U.S.? So Mom had very few options. Remember, she's stuck in a detention camp. So she went to the commander, as I said, person in charge. And luckily, he happened to be a captain in the Dutch Navy. Now, before she went to see him, she came to me and asked for my stamp collection. And she explained that this person was going to help us take a ship and come to America, where my dad was now waiting for us. And I remembered that she wouldn't allow me to take anything but this one stamp collection. She had learned that the commander was a stamp collector. She thought that she could give him my stamp collection, even though it was not worth much. I mean, it isn't like she could buy flowers or candy. This is a detention camp. And so she thought that would be a good idea to show her goodwill by handing him my stamp collection. And I simply wouldn't part with it. I became very stubborn. And I told her, I don't care. I am not giving you my stamp collection. And so she had no choice but to leave. And one day, after I was playing out on the grounds and went back, each of us had a cot, one after another. And I had my suitcase under the cot. And when I pulled it out, inside my suitcase was all my stuff. And I was getting something out, and I saw my stamp collection, which was always on top, was missing. And I knew immediately she stole it. I knew that none of the girls that were in this dormitory, which is what it was called, with one cot after another, would be taking my stamp collection. And that's exactly what happened. Mom had gone into the dorm when I was out and taken the stamp collection, and she gave it to the commander. And I personally think he would have helped us with or without my stamp collection. But the bottom line is she gave it to him and took it from me, for which I didn't forgive her. And he explained to her that there aren't any more ships leaving Holland, but there's still ships from Belgium, Antwerp, and recommended that she goes to Antwerp, and he would help her get transportation on a ship from Antwerp, Belgium, which is what happened. So we were able to leave the camp before it was, a couple of weeks later it was dissolved, and everyone went to Westerbork. But we were fortunate to be able to leave before that, and we went to Antwerp, Belgium. That's where we took the ship. So can we stop somewhere? I need some eye drops or something. Huh? So remind me where we were.
You and your mother have boarded the ship in Antwerp to come to America.
Oh, we were already on our way to America, right?
Right.
No, we were in Antwerp. Yeah, I know exactly. No, we were in Antwerp. We're in Antwerp. We had a wonderful surprise. Mom's younger sister, Liesel, and her husband, Walter, were also in Antwerp. And they were going to take the same ship we were to come to America. What had happened on Kristallnacht, Walter, Liesel's husband, was taken to the Buchenwald concentration camp, and I won't go into these experiences, but he was able to get out, and they had gone to another country, and Antwerp was apparently one of the very few ports in Europe that still allowed ships to come to the U.S. Coincidentally, they happened to be taking the same ship. Now you have to understand, neither sister knew about the other. So Liesl didn't know that Mom and I would be taking the ship from Holland to go to America. And we didn't know she was going to be there. And for me, there was a little extra dividend because my aunt and uncle were first class. We were third class. Every morning on the trip, I remember taking long steps all the way up to first class. Nobody bothered me. I ate all my meals with my aunt and uncle, even though I was supposed to be in third class. But nobody paid attention to me. So that was fine. But I was getting very nervous, and I didn't believe anything Mom said at this point. I realized, of course, that my parents love me and they want the best for me, but I also understood that there are things that happen that they have no control over. So I knew all these happenings from ship to ship, etc., wasn't under their control, and I just didn't believe anything Mom was saying. She was now telling me, we're going to America and be with your dad. And I didn't believe it, but I didn't tell her that. So it wasn't until we actually got to New York Harbor. I'm going down the gangplank, and there's my dad running towards me. Then I realized she's telling me the truth. And I was happy. He just picks me up and he twirls me around, and I'm happy. And then I look around. This is New York Harbor. And I don't know if you've been to Europe, so you know everybody moves at a leisurely pace. In New York Harbor, everybody's rushing somewhere. So I get scared. I thought something's happening again. And I say to my dad, in German, of course, what's going on? Where's everybody rushing to? And he laughs. And he says, this is America. And so it is. And I am very lucky, very, very lucky to be in this wonderful country we call the United States of America.
So how long had it been from the time your father left Europe to the time you guys were reunited in New York?
Roughly a year, roughly.
And was your father living in New York, or had he settled somewhere else?
I hadn't told the story of how Dad was able to get our affidavits to come to America in the first place. I explained earlier that we go all the way back to the 15th century, and Dad had in his possession his grandmother's Bible. And on the back pages were names, addresses of family members that had emigrated from Germany throughout the years. And he wrote to all of them, pleading with them to help us get out of Germany, and got one response from a very, very distant cousin, Henry Katz. Now, Henry Katz lived in America. He lived in Philly, in Germantown. He was married to a Quaker. He had no children, and he wrote Dad he would help us come to the U.S. So when Dad arrived, and he did help us, when Dad arrived, he came to Philly because that's where Henry Katz was, and he lived in Germantown. That's the reason we came to Philadelphia. And he stayed. My father.
Did your father work while in America? Did he have a job already? Oh,
yes. My dad never wanted to work for anyone else. Even as a teenager, he went by himself as a traveling salesman as a kid because his father died. He was only 14 at the time, and he helped pay the fees for the rest of the family. But that's how he started a store in Germany. And by the time he met my mother, he already was a businessman. He had, a lot of people working for him. But in America, it's the same thing. He told me that he never wanted to work for anyone else. He said, you can work and work and work and then be fired. I'm going to work hard, but for me. And so he, without knowing a language, began to sell. Have you heard of Electrolux vacuum cleaners?
Yes.
They're kind of heavy. People don't use them anymore today. They're a little heavy. Well, he began to sell the vacuum cleaner. And he went, today you really actually can't even do this. At that time you could. You'd go from door to door. And Dad went from door to door. And as soon as they saw him, they knew refugees were coming into this country. And he didn't know the language. And there were people, Americans, who purchased they bought it from him. And that's how he began earning a living, by selling them. He said, just didn't want to work for other people. Eventually, he opened a small store here in America. Nothing compared to Germany, but again, to be his own boss. But that's how he began, by selling and for the first couple of weeks, we lived with the Katzes. Just for a short time, and then we got a house with Liesl and Walter, rented, not bought, rented. They had the third floor, and we had the second floor in Germantown. That's how we began. But for me, it was, I had a pretty upsetting childhood, but this was the worst. When his wife, who was never overly fond of us, said, this kid has to go to school. That's me. I was 8 then. First of all, I had the eye infection. If you remember, my eye rims was so red that occasionally when Mom and I would go somewhere, a person from the street would tell to my mother, what is wrong with her? Because you see the redness, and we couldn't afford a doctor, and it was inflamed. And the only reason they weren't inflamed was because they weren't treated. Now, it wasn't the eye itself, you understand. It was just we didn't have money for clothing, so I still wore the German stuff, which had gone small, and I was very skinny because there wasn't enough food in Holland. That's why I was so I wasn't exactly the most attractive girl on the block. And I think I didn't mention the story. Before we left, we were permission to leave Rotterdam West. I had to get a checkup by a doctor. And Mom took me, we had a small clinic there. And I remember sitting on the toilet seat, and she had, I don't know if you ever saw those double combs for lice. I was sitting on the toilet seat, and I still remember my mother brushing my hair with the comb, and I could visibly the lice. I don't know how often I washed my hair, obviously not too often, and she had to get rid of the lice before I would be inspected, so I could pass and come to America with her. So it took a long time, and I remember some horrible stuff she put in my hair, which smelled, to kill the lice. And she cut it really, really short, really, really short. And so here I am in America, really, really short hair, red eyes, skinny, German clothes, not fashionable. My first day of school. Everybody's coming towards me. It looked like, but there's probably just a few kids, screaming something called hello. I had no clue what they were saying, but I was used to being ignored and used to derogatory comments from the Germans. So I assumed I'm getting a derogatory comment, but I didn't know what they were saying. So they put me in third grade because I'm not 9 years old now, and I belong in third grade. But remember, I was thrown out of first grade. And I had no education since. I didn't get any smarter. So 3rd grade and 4th grade in the Mifflin School, where Eleanor was his wife's name, taught kindergarten, I handed back an empty paper, and my report card said S, that's satisfactory, U, unsatisfactory. So my parents were working, and weren't paying that much attention to me because they're trying to get more relatives out of Germany. That was more important. Didn't realize the troubles I was having. So I did nothing in 3rd grade, nothing in 4th grade. Luckily for me, Dad moved to Feltonville, and I had to move to another school. And the school that I went to in 5th grade, can't think of it, Clara Barton School. The 5th grade teacher, for the first time, took a personal interest in me, and I had to stay after school, and I had to start doing homework and start what I should have done already back in 3rd grade. And I didn't appreciate it, but my parents did. And sometimes I spent hours in her classroom. Just think the time that she's taking for me, which of course I didn't recognize because it was on her own time. And she did something for me that to this day I appreciate. She showed me the free library. I didn't know there was such a thing as a library. She took me across the street from the Clara Barton School, I think it's still there, to a library. She introduced me to the librarian, and they explained to me I'm allowed to take a book out. I don't have to pay money. I just have to return it at a particular date. That entire summer I spent in the library with a German dictionary in English and a book. And it took me time to read a page. I came across a word I didn't know. I'd look it up in my dictionary so I understood the story. And that's how I learned English. And I was very grateful to her that I could do this. And it didn't cost me anything. The books were free. And that's how I spent my summer. So, but my first couple of years in the U.S. were the worst that I ever had, because also I had no friends. But this time I didn't have friends because I couldn't respond. The girls tried to talk to me, and I didn't know what they were saying, so they just ignored me, logically. So I learned the hard way.
What year did you arrive in America?
39, I think it was November 10th or something, in America. Right.
Do you remember how or when you first started to know about what was happening in Europe?
I think I was in high school and I read a book called While 6 Million Died by Arthur Morse. And that's when I learned for the very first time what the St. Louis was all about. That we weren't allowed to get off the ship because Cuba wouldn't allow us entry, even though we had those legal landing certificates. The whole thing was money. They wanted more money than we were able to give at the time. So I became very interested, and I started studying the Holocaust. And then everything went into place, and everything began to make sense. And, I got the background on that. But I had no idea that I was in a ship which had become famous because it went from port to port. I know Canada wouldn't let us in, and on we went. There were more countries that wouldn't let us in than finally permitted us to come in. And the sad thing was that the people on the ship, they were well-to-do, because if you were in the lower socioeconomic ladder, you didn't have a chance. Everything cost money, so you didn't really have a chance. And secondly, they were well-educated, and they were the kind of people like my dad who took care of them. My dad never took a penny from America. We didn't get federal aid. we didn't get state aid. We didn't get city aid. We got no aid from anybody. We lived on what we had and what Dad provided, which is why we lived very, very frugally. But we didn't get any help from the government or anything. But Dad always said he didn't want or expect any help. He said he'll take care of his own family. Mom worked, of course, too, here in the U.S. The biggest thing was the language. My first friends were German Jews. We started our own little group, the older people. And that made, because on Sundays we used to walk in Fairmount Park. And we couldn't afford to go to a movie or anything. So we walked in Fairmount Park. That was our recreation. But at least it was people to talk to.
Looking back, how do you perceive the international response to the plight of the St. Louis passengers?
Oh, it's exceedingly poor. They simply ignored us. I mean, when you think about it, Cuba allowed us to come to Cuba, gave us right papers so we had to buy, and then wouldn't let us in. And the United States, think of it, Roosevelt wouldn't let us in, even though legally we came 2 months later. Ellis Island was open. We could have been quarantined. I mean, all things that could have. And also one final cablegram was sent by Gustav Schröder to the president, to Roosevelt, to allow the 200 kids in. And he didn't even respond to that. That would have included me. Frankly, I don't care. I'm glad. I'd rather stay with my mother. But the point is, it did keep others. Can't just think of me. I mean, there were others that ended up in Holland, Belgium, and France that didn't make it. You know, all those in England, of course, were saved.
Can you tell me about your family members, your extended family members? What happened to them? Did many survive?
Oh yeah, that's what the one. I lost almost my entire family. So I never really got to know them because I was young when I left Germany. But I knew my mother's older sister, Idel, and she and her husband, Otto, and my niece, that is her, my niece, her daughter, Helga, all died in a concentration camp. They were not able to get out. And my parents sent letter, affidavit. This is another way for the Germans to make money, because each paper you send, each document, you include money. And it all adds up when you have very little. And though they send the decline that she can't come, they all kept the money in addition to that. So it made it a real struggle, really hard. So especially as I am a senior, and though my daughter's wonderful, and I have a son and another daughter in Teaneck, that's great, but that's all. That's because I got married and had children. But I'm sure you can talk about your aunt, maybe your mom's, I'm making this up, of course, your mom's sister and so forth and so, other relatives. If I had lived in Germany, I'd have lots of different relatives to be part of my family.
So your father was never successful to bring anybody from Germany over?
No, he was. His brothers, yes, he helped his brothers. The two brothers went to Shanghai illegally, but when he helped them come from Shanghai to America. Now the younger brother Willie stayed here, and I had him for a bunch of years. But the older brother Siegfried went right to Israel. It was still Palestine turning into Israel. When the United Nations were making the declarations that it would be Israel. So he felt that every Jewish person should be in Israel. And that's where he went. So he did help his brothers, yes.
Whatever happened to the land in Palestine that your father purchased?
No idea. Dad says, forget about it. That's my dad. No, I'm sure somebody took it over. Maybe the government. I don't know. But he never researched it because the whole point was for us to live there. But once we came here, we stayed in the United States.
When and where did you marry?
In Philly. The interesting thing is, when I met my husband, I was still in high school, a little over 16. He had come from the Army. They had sent him to the Pacific. Anyway, I went out with him for a couple of months. I had no clue that he was a German Jew because his parents lived in Elma, New Jersey, so I didn't meet them. And he had no clue because we didn't talk about your background. But one day, while he was waiting for me to finish up, he was looking at the book titles in my mother's library, and she had a bunch of German books because she's, her German was fluent. And he wondered, and he said to me, "How come your mom, had these German?" And I explained, "Well, we're from Germany." And he said, "Oh, me too." And the funny thing is, he had come about the same time I had. But, of course, he had a totally different story. He came with his mom. And I think we discussed that December the 5th, 1941, they were able to get the father out. His mother was Swiss. Paul's mother was Swiss. He had a sister. It was the three of them. And after Kristallnacht, what had happened was she grew up in Switzerland. She went through college, all in Switzerland. She had an offer of a good job in Germany, so she moves to Germany. She meets her husband, Paul's father, and they live in Germany. Comes Kristallnacht. She sees what's going on right there in Germany. She wants to go back to Switzerland. She goes to Switzerland, which is where she was born and raised, with her two kids. And they won't allow her German Jewish husband into Switzerland.
But they would allow the children.
They were her kids. I mean, she had very proof of whatever he needed. They're her kids and his kids too. So she would have stayed in Switzerland, she told me. But she wanted her husband too. So and I thought this was interesting, had no problem coming to the U.S. from Switzerland. She said she made one phone, the consulate, that's the name I was looking for, one phone call to the American consulate that she wanted to move from Switzerland to the U.S., and immediately said, okay. And that was it. She took a next ship with the boys, boy and girl, Henny, and came to the U.S. and had all the trouble getting the husband out of Germany. And he just made it right before Pearl Harbor. But that was her reason for coming to the United States. That she wanted her, which makes perfectly good sense to me. But it's shocking how the other countries kept the Jews out. And I think that Switzerland is a good example of that. Not letting the husband in.
Do you remember what year it was that you and Paul got married?
Oh.
Do you recall the year you and Paul got married?
No, I hadn't even thought of that. 1948, December. I know we got married December 25th. I think it was 1948. Yeah, we were quite young, yeah.
And you mentioned that you have children. How many children did you have, and what are their names? Fine.
Debbie and our daughter Charlotte, in Teaneck, and David lives in the other end of the city. Unfortunately, I lost 2 children. My oldest son, Robert, he had a heart attack, and unfortunately, a little girl, Cheryl, when she was 8, Dr. Coop, who was the Attorney General at that particular time, was the head of Children's Hospital, and he said that she had a small tumor on her kidney, and it should be removed. And that was the mistake, because they used X-rays way back then. Remember, I'm married many years, and the X-rays really caused the cancer that she developed. If I'd left her alone, she would have been fine. But again, I was all of 20-something, and we were at a point at that age where if the doctor said jump, you say, how high? Today, a doctor says jump, and you say, why? I mean, I don't take anybody's word for anything, I check everything through. The point is, but back then we were naive kids, and when the doctor said she needed the operation, this was Dr. Coop himself, the head of Children's Hospital, and later on he became the Attorney General. We did what he said, which was a mistake, but it's easy to, it was many years ago, and we didn't know any different.
Did you work? What did you do for work?
I was a medical tech. We had a medical laboratory. My husband actually wanted to be a doctor, and I guess if he hadn't married me, he would have become one, because this is all about money. We had to work. He didn't have the money. When he was ready to earn money, he was in high school when Pearl Harbor happened. He wanted to fight the Germans. He was in 11th grade, Elmer, New Jersey, and didn't even finish high school. When he enlisted in the Army, 17 going on 18, guess where they sent him? To the Pacific. He fought in Korea. Well, that's where Uncle Sam sent him. So, but he was able to go to college free, courtesy of the American government, and he went to University of Pennsylvania. That's how I met him, because he lived in Jersey. But after this is the Bill of Rights. This is after the Army, after they. He was one of the lucky ones, because they were going to attack. He was in the group. They were going to attack Japan. They were going to go right into his whole unit, and they were getting all kinds of warnings from the higher ups about they have to be very, that Japanese are big fighters. One day they all met, and the general said, "You're all discharged." What had happened is the president, Truman, dropped the bomb. And though I know there's big talk about should they have sent the bomb into Germany or not, the point is it saved thousands of lives. All those guys like Paul, like my husband, that were fighting in the Pacific, it saved their lives. So different ways of looking at it.
Yeah. So where do you stand religiously today?
Religiously?
Yes.
I would say conservative.
Okay. Did you and your parents ever speak about Europe, the Holocaust, or was it largely something that just didn't get spoken about?
Very little. My dad always said to me, "Why do you do this? Why do you talk?" Because I used to talk years ago to adults. I felt it was an important story. I thought it should be told way before it became popular to discuss it, way before Hammock and stuff like that. Obviously, I couldn't get into schools. They had to have a program. You just don't walk in. So I would speak to adults. And one time when I spoke to this adult group, the guy who was still in uniform actually stood up and said, "You better listen to her because everything she says is true." And he explained, first of all, he said, "I'm not Jewish," but they were passing Auschwitz. There was a command not too far from Auschwitz, and that is when the Americans came in, and there was a rubber factory about 5 miles from Auschwitz, and they bombed that rubber factory. He was a flyer, and he said he saw what was happening at Auschwitz. He could look down and he sees. And he said he and his buddies offered to fly and bomb Auschwitz on their own time and without pay, because he didn't like what he was seeing, you know. And he said he went all the way up to Eisenhower, and finally he was refused. They would not allow them to bomb Auschwitz. The excuse was they're going to kill a lot of Jews. But I've spoken to a half a dozen Auschwitz survivors, guys, and they all said they were praying and waiting for the bombs to drop. They wanted Auschwitz to be bombed. So was the American government. I wouldn't allow it. And now, if I had the same guy, I would make him record it. But he was still annoyed. He said he felt that it should have been bombed, and they were willing to do it. And they knew exactly what was going on. The U.S. government knew what was happening in Europe. All the time they said, "Oh, my goodness," they didn't know. Then the soldiers coming into the concentration camps, the GIs, they didn't know until they went in and saw what was happening. But the big shots, Eisenhower, all the rest of, the generals, they knew what was going on.
So about how long would you say you've been speaking?
I don't know. I'd say I was about...
Do you have a guess?
Being in high school, I had to have graduated high school. Yeah. I guess 20? 21? I'm not sure. I'm thinking I was married. By the way, my biggest anti-Semitic incident happened right here in Philly. I had just graduated, become medical tech, looking for my first job. I was at this doctor's office. I was hired. He said to me, it seemed like a nice job. He said, start on Monday. And then I was at the door, and I started to say goodbye, and he said, "Hey, by the way, you're not a Jew." And I said, "I am." And he said, "I'm sorry, I don't hire Jews." So I was hired and fired within a few minutes. I thought that was an anti-Semitic. Today, this guy wouldn't say anymore, "You're a Jew," but he'd come up with another excuse, something like, "I forgot I have another person I want to interview. I'll let you know." You know what I mean?
Yes.
Because it's not savvy to say the truth. But I never forgot that. Hired and fired, my first job.
What lessons do you think the world should learn from the SS St. Louis incident?
It's so hard to say because it's happening all over again in Israel after October the 7th. So I used to be optimistic. I used to think once there's a state of Israel, as Jewish people could be safe, would be safe, they'd have a place to go. I'm not that sure anymore. It's such a dangerous world. I can just say, may God bless this tiny land of Israel, which is absolutely a beacon of light all among our nations, and may it bless our country as well. I mean, you really have to leave it to faith. We're living in... It's almost impossible to know what to do because situations happen that are exceedingly unexpected. When I hear of the atrocities committed the 7th, it's something, there's things I never heard of in Germany. some heinous.
To clarify, you're referencing October 7th?
Yeah. Then they took the babies from the pregnant women, took the ears out and cut it in half. I mean, it's inconceivable, the inhumanity. And even the world's attitude when the 4 hostages were finally released, instead of saying this is the right thing to do, they want to. It was the English BBC or whatever, I never watched that program, was saying, did you warn the Palestinians? You're going to warn or come in and take, and some of them are actually have hostages in their homes. So it's a difficult world. And I say with God's help, we'll have peace. I can't depend on man. There's too much out there today.
You may have already answered this, but is there any message you would like to give the world?
Help us sit back.
Well, I just wish that there'd be peace and goodness and not so much hate. We were discussing that just recently, how easy it seems to be for people to hate instead of working together and helping each other.
Thank you.
So we did it? No? It's really wonderful to be able to allow my daughter to speak. She's been such an asset and such a wonderful help to me. All my children have. But Debbie is an especially wonderful daughter, and you will hear all about it from her.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you for being here with us. What do you think of your mother speaking and sharing her story?
I think it's terrific. I really do. I mean, my whole life, I'm the youngest of 5. So I grew up with a different mom than maybe my first sibling had, because there was a 15-year difference between us. But the conversation of the Holocaust and the family that was lost and the plight of the Jewish people as a whole, that was a daily conversation at the table. In my age as I am right now, listening to folks with whom she has met and spoke with, I see the impact that her story has made, and I absolutely see the value in general for my mom sharing her story.
Do you think you'll ever be a speaker and continue on telling her story?
Unfortunately, I do. I do see the need for this. I think there is always going to be the unfortunate element of anti-Semitism that permeates society, and I do feel the need to really speak about this, especially as there are people that still really deny the events of the Holocaust and question any of the statistics and stories around it.
Thank you both so much. Thank you.
Thank you. When she was that age. Wonder what she was thinking.
All right, Ronnie, who's in this picture? What's this picture?
Oh, description of the picture?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's my mom contemplating her future back in Milan, where she was born.
Okay. Ronnie,
Mom and her,
who's this picture of? What's in the shot?
a mom and her friends just gossiping.
Which one?
Mom is the one who's turning her head back. See? You see which one?
Yep.
What year was this? Maybe.
Does it say in the back? I don't know.
Okay, we'll look at it. And we'll cut
It
there.
might say
Ronnie, who's in this picture?
World War One. My dad is on my right, and his younger brother Willie on the left, around 1914. They both served in France. Dad got the Iron Cross for saving a comrade back in France during the fighting. Kirchheim, where I grew up. Kirchheim Untertech. Renate at 2.
What's this a photo of?
The house that we lived in, our store is on the first floor, our residence on the second.
Thank you. What's this a document of?
That's of the Mom's passport and mine.
Okay.
We do like 10 more seconds. No, let's have her do that.
Flipped it?
Yeah, yeah, just gently.
Yeah,
Did you start it yet?
yeah. This says passport.
Okay.
J stands for Juden.
Okay.
So every Jewish passport is stamped. Because normally when you get a passport, it's not going to be stamped, whether you're a Christian or what you are. That every Jewish male was given the middle name Israel. So it's Gustav Israel Reutlinger, courtesy of the German government, who gave the name Israel to every Jewish male. Again, it's to distinguish them from anyone else. I didn't do that with the females, Ellie, Sarah.
And who's this?
Who is this? Who's in the passport?
It's the same passport.
Is this your father?
Yeah, Dad's passport. Gustav Reutlinger.
Who's in this photograph?
Now? Oh, Mom's older sister, Idel, who was murdered in a concentration camp.
Do you know what camp?
It's
Oh,
in that
the document.
book. At the very end where it says, remember? You have to read. You have to read the. That's. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Either. So I'm not going to try to pronounce that. What's this a photograph of?
On the ship, the St. Louis, in 1939, while we were traveling to Cuba, a few days earlier, the captain had given a ball, and that's Mom dancing at the ball. The ship was the St. Louis.
This one, I don't want to take. What is this document?
This document is the naturalization papers when Dad became a citizen in America.
All right.
Oh no, we have the Inquirer. The Inquirer. I never read that. I call it a rag, but.
So, Ronnie, what is this a picture of?
It's a picture of the passengers on the ship, the St. Louis, as they were seeking a home because they had been turned down in Cuba from entering the country. So they're, this is a Swiss paper from a Swiss newspaper telling the story of the ship, the St. Louis.
And are you the person with the X above the head?
That was Mom and I with the little X on top. Mom and I as passengers.
Thank you.
Off?
Ronnie, what is this a photo of? What is this?
Oh, this is a photo of the ball that the captain, Gustav Schröder, the German captain, gave for the passengers on the St. Louis. It was a celebration. 2 days later, they went to Cuba. Prior to their going to Cuba, just having a good time at the ball on the ship, the St. Louis.
Who is she dancing with? Do you know? Do you know who she's dancing with?
No clue.
Thank you.
That was the picture. I wasn't allowed to show. Sure. This is a picture of my dad in Cuba with others, and they are getting a briefing as to what's happening to the passengers on the ship, the St. Louis. All of them have family members that they love on the ship, and the ship is not able to land in Cuba, and they're getting a briefing as to what is going on, and just getting information is really.
And which one's your father?
The one in the first row with a tie. Oh, the second in the first row.
Okay.
Point to.
Great, thank you for that.
Okay.
Oh yeah,
What this
sure.
document is?
I was looking for the card from Willie. Does it say it clearer? Now?
Yep.
This is a cablegram Dad sent when he arrived in America to my mother. We were still in Rotterdam West detention camp, that he arrived safely, that he was going to Washington to get us the proper documents in order for us to join him in America, and then he was going to Philly to find an apartment for us to stay. This is,
Can you talk us through this?
a postcard I received while I was in Rotterdam West detention camp from my favorite Uncle Willie, who was still in Germany at that time.
Why is it important that we know that it was Rotterdam West?
Only because they demolished it. That's why they came over here to get free.
Right.
It's off the books.
Right.
You know, if you were, you know how they have at detention camps, they have people speak and tell you, you know, this is what happened in this particular camp, so forth and so on. They will tell you these people from the St. Louis were sent to us in Holland, 181, and they all went to the Westerberg concentration camp. Well, the real story is that they all went to Rotterdam West, where they were separated in two compounds. Remember, the adult compound, the children's compound, none of which they had at the other place, the fact that they were separated. But this is just proof. But it's not going to mean anything to anybody,
Thank you, Ronnie.
including the Dutch people.